This is the fifth video in the fundamentals of biology, and today we're going to be going over cellular respiration. So first let's talk about redox reaction, also known as reduction-oxidation reactions. So what reduction is when something gains an electron. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but you can think about it like if something had a more negative charge due to the gaining of electrons, it will be reduced. On the other hand, oxidation is the losing of electrons, and that's when it has a more positive charge. So one way you can remember this is through oil rig. So oxidation is loss and reduction is gain. So let's see how cellular respiration plays into this. So in this equation, you can see that glucose is being oxidized into carbon dioxide, whereas water is being reduced into water. And in cellular respiration, energy is also produced in the form of ATP. And respiration is an exergonic reaction, meaning it releases energy. So let's go over aerobic respiration, which happens in the presence of oxygen. The first step is called glycolysis. It will occur in the cytosol of the cell. It will not actually happen in the mitochondria yet, which will happen later. And what it does, it turns glucose into two molecules called pyruvate. And it will produce 2 ATP, and it will be called substrate level phosphorylation. The next step is the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. It will now occur in the matrix of the mitochondria. And what happens is it completes the glucose oxidation, and the ATP produced is also 2, and it's also substrate level phosphorylation. And finally, we have oxidative phosphorylation, which happens in the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. And what happens is we use transported electrons to produce ATP. And whereas the first two steps only produced a few ATP, in this step we'll produce around 28. So the first step is called glycolysis. So in order to produce ATP in this step, we have to invest 2 ATP first. So in the first step, we have to invest 2 ATP, but eventually we're going to form 4 ATP at the end. So there's going to be a net total of 2. And NAD plus is a coenzyme, and it's also known as an electron acceptor, which means it will take an electron and act as an oxidizing agent to become NADH, which is the reduced form of NAD+, carrying an electron. And as a result, 2 water molecules are going to form as a byproduct in glycolysis. The next step is pyruvate oxidation. So before the citric acid cycle can start, we have to go through pyruvate oxidation. So as I said before entering the citric acid cycle, the pyruvate has to be converted into something called acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA. And this will occur inside the mitochondria. And what happens in the pyruvate oxidation is CO2 will be released, and it will also create NADH, and the coenzyme A will attach to this 2-carbon molecule, become acetyl-CoA. Next step is called the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. So the purpose of the Krebs cycle is to create carbon dioxide. And the products of the citric acid cycle include 3 NADH electron carriers as well as FADH2 electron carriers. And these happen through the reduction of NAD plus and FAD respectively. And in the cycle, 2 carbon dioxide are also produced as a byproduct, here and here. And this cycle will repeat twice for each glucose, because in the beginning we started with 3 carbon, and we had to take one out in the previous step, which created acetyl-CoA, and glucose has 6 carbons, so you will need 3 plus 3. And as a result, a 4-carbon molecule is regenerated, oxaloacetate, and it will reattach to acetyl-CoA to become citrate and go through the entire cycle again. In oxidative phosphorylation, the first step is the electron transport chain, or abbreviated the ETC. And the ETC is found inside the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And with the NADH and the FADH2 electron carriers, they're going to pass these electrons through these proteins, such as this cytochrome over here, and they will pass along the ETC. And as a result, energy is released and hydrogen ions will be pumped from the matrix to the intermembrane space. And because of these pumping of H plus ions into the intermembrane space, there's going to be a lot of buildup on one side, whereas the matrix will have less. And this brings us to chemiosmosis. And because of the H plus concentration, and H plus cannot pass through this inner membrane to reestablish equilibrium, it must use a protein called ATP synthase. And this H plus gradient is called the proton motive force. So this catalyzes the phosphorylation of ADP into ATP, generating energy. So as these H plus ions pass through this ATP synthase, ATP will be produced. And there would be 26 to 28 per glucose for around 30 to 32 total, because if you remember, there was 2 from the first step and 2 from the second step. And H plus will attach to oxygen, or O2, and that's how water is created as a byproduct. Anaerobic respiration or fermentation happens when there is no oxygen available. So without oxygen to accept these hydrogen protons, only substrate level phosphorylation is possible, and only 2 ATP per glucose can be produced compared to a total 32 in aerobic when oxygen is available. And this consists of glycolysis and the regeneration of NAD+. So in alcoholic fermentation, you will produce something called ethanol, which involves the removal of carbon dioxide over here, and it is commonly used in yeast for wine and baking. So you can see it first starts with glycolysis, and after NADH is produced, it will be used up and turned into NAD+, and that will be regenerated for the cycle. The same thing happens with lactic acid fermentation, but instead there is no CO2 involved, and it will produce lactate. And it is used by humans after strenuous exercise when oxygen is scarce, and is also used in fungi and bacteria for things such as cheese and yogurt. So now let's talk about the difference between obligate anaerobes and facultative anaerobes. So obligate anaerobes will always use anaerobic respiration, and they can actually not survive in aerobic conditions or conditions with oxygen. Whereas facultative anaerobes will use anaerobic respiration when there's no oxygen, but they can still use aerobic respiration under the presence of oxygen. Thanks for watching this video. This video covered reduction-oxidation reactions, aerobic respiration, and also anaerobic respiration.